So today, people are seriously aware of the quality of their food because they know that it's one of the keys to well-being. This third session of the conference is going to tackle the issue of future food that we'll all be eating soon. It's called Alternative Protein, Lab-Grown Meat, Vertical Farming, 3D Printed Sushi, and food is getting pretty funky these days. So please welcome our participants for this session, the Executive Director at Food Industry Asia, or FIA, Matthew Kovac, and CSO at Hubba, Archawat Jarunsin, who will be the moderator for this fireside chat.
Morning. Good morning, Matt.
Morning.
How are you?
I'm very good, thanks.
Very good. We're going to be talking about food today. I hope you guys had good breakfast. It was estimated that by the year 2030, human population will grow to become a number of 10 billion people. So it is a tall order to feed 10 billion people, right? It is a very tall order to feed 10 billion people well. And it is a very, very, very tall order to feed 10 billion people well, at the same time leave a positive impact, on environment and societies, right? Good news is, there's a lot of people that are working toward achieving that, right? So Matt, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your role within Food Industry Asia and how you guys in the food industry are making this happen.
Sure. So good morning, everyone. My name is Matt. I work with an organization called Food Industry Asia. We're actually based in Singapore. And we cover the Asia-Pacific region, and we work with about 45 of the biggest food companies on the planet, ranging from up at the farm gate all the way down to big consumer brands that you're all familiar with, and increasingly with startups as well. And our role is really to help guide some of the companies and push and nudge them to create the right type of policies and regulations in the market so many of these new foods, many of these new processes can come to market. And our ethos is basically if food isn't safe and nutritious, then it's not food.
Cool. So in your line of work, in the past few years, what do you see as a major food trends that happening? What kind of innovation that emerging from the industry players?
Actually, there's tons. So the guy that was just up here just now who introduced us, he mentioned quite a few. We don't have time to go through all of them, but I think some of the most exciting areas at the moment for the food industry and what's captured the imagination is around plant-based. Okay, so that's plant-based ingredients. So that's looking at alternatives to meat and other sorts of ingredients and other biodiverse ingredients that can be used in food production. And so right now what we're seeing is about a $22 to $25 billion market for plant-based. Right. But over the next decade, that could easily increase to about $180 billion. So there's a lot of action around this kind of this market right now, this sector right now. But also increasingly, in terms of growing markets, certainly in this part of the world, there's still obviously a big demand for processed foods. And so that's a market that's not going to go away. So what you see as a key trend is food companies looking at how they can reduce and extract and take out sugar, salt, and fat within their product categories and their portfolios, basically across different categories, and how they're trying to put more healthier ingredients in as well. And that's not just plant-based. That could be things from fibers to proteins, vitamins, and even through fortification, what we see in some countries, in particular like in India as well. So those are a couple of the real key trends that many of the companies are focusing their attention on.
Let me probe a little bit on that trends. And is this new trend that's emerging? Is this being driven, by the industry itself, or is it being driven by consumers?
That's a good question. I think it's a little bit of both, but I would say that it's actually been driven by consumers, particularly on the plant-based side, right? And that's because you've had quite a niche market in terms of vegetarians and vegans. It's niche in the sense of the West, and there's quite a few vegetarians in India. Let me qualify that a minute. Right. But in terms of the vegan market, and they've been pushing their philosophy, on not eating meat and animal welfare, and that's kind of migrated and translated into the more general market where these plant-based foods, so what the Impossible Burger that launched in Asia, Beyond Meat, which is one of the most successful IPOs of the year. which now has a valuation of around 12, 13 billion, I think. I had a quick look at their share price. That's big, right? And the market they're addressing is not vegan. It's just every day. They're trying to say, look, if we can go at least 1, maybe 2 days a week without eating meat, and that's primarily beef because of the contribution that's making to greenhouse gases and some of the impact that's having on the environment is pretty negative. And so they're saying, hey, if we can address that market of meat eaters, then that's an even bigger addressable market, and we're doing good as well by trying to be more sustainable in our production methods.
Yeah, we talk about, alternative protein, we talk about vertical farming, so on and so forth, right? What about at the earlier stage of the food supply chain, agriculture? Are you seeing, the same level of enthusiasm and also the advancement of technology or innovation happening there as well? If not, do you foresee that if agriculture are not moving as fast as, food ready to eat for consumer, would that create some kind of bottleneck?
Okay, so last year, let's look at this, right? In terms of the ag tech sector globally, about $17 billion went in from VCs, okay? And that's incubation early stage through to later stage. Compared with some of you others in the other industries in technology, it's nothing. But for the ag and food industry, which is about an $8 trillion industry and extremely traditional and hasn't innovated a huge amount even over the last 100 years, we still have canned tuna, right? There's not much happening there. So that's quite a lot of action. About 10 billion of that has gone downstream, and that's mainly in actual foods, ingredients, but also in restaurant delivery platforms, for example, like in India with Swiggy, which is $1 billion went into this company in India for basically online restaurant delivery. And because of rapid urbanization in India, people not going out to eat because it's hard, you get stuck in traffic for 2 hours, why would you do that? And so a lot of investment's gone into that part. But that represented about 40% of the total amount invested in the food system in India. It's good, but I'm saying you need more investment upstream in ag, where we actually grow the food. So about $7 billion last year went into ag, but the amount of deals was actually more, which is encouraging. So the type of things that they're looking at, it could be on areas around cellular agriculture, or some people call it clean meat or slaughter-free meat, where you take a cell tissue from one cow, and then you grow, basically, you're not quite growing steak yet, but you're kind of growing in the lab ground beef. And they're doing this with aquaculture as well. It could be crustaceans or it could be shrimps too. So we're not at the stage yet where we're growing actual, big slabs of meat. Although there's a company from Israel called Aleph Farms that's trying to work on that. So far it's at 2 inches, so it's getting there. There's another company in Singapore called Shop Meats that's working on the aquaculture. And of course there's Mosa Meats that started this. So there's investment going into there. And it's quite conceivable that in the future, who knows, right? If consumers accept this type of food, that we could all be eating lab-grown meat instead of the actual, the way that traditionally processed, where it's traditionally raised with a calf and then you, a few years later, then you slaughter that calf and then you eat the meat. So that's one area. Other areas include, I would say, around robotics and AI. So partly because of labor shortages in the agricultural sector, where you've got to look at automating processes significantly more. Basically, certainly in Asia, there's a massive aging population when it comes to farmers. The average age is something like 65 up to 70. People don't want to work on farms anymore. You've got to look at automating and looking at other processes or robotics or AI that can help support with that as well. And of course, we have vertical farming. As McKinsey reported a few years ago, we're going to have many of the biggest mega cities are going to be in Asia. Already we have Shanghai, Calcutta, Mumbai. These are big cities, right? But we're getting to 40, 50 million people population in these cities, right? So you're going to have to look at how we utilize and grow food in a city, because the logistics and the supply chain of getting that food from out of the city in the country into a massive urban area like that is going to be extremely challenging. And the type of foods. We all want healthy and more natural foods, okay? Everything in moderation with processed foods, but that's going to be really, really difficult. And how do you maintain the integrity and the food safety of those products as well? So vertical farming is going to be bigger, and the commercials around this have improved. So there are opportunities to make money. Where there's challenges still is in sort of the lower value types of vegetables like lettuce, some of those green leafy ones that we want to eat. Not everyone can afford to eat kale, and not everyone wants to eat kale.
Okay, cool. I think that's a good news, right? Seems like for the entire supply chain of food, innovation is happening in every stages. So that's truly good news. Let's switch now to some areas that involving food industry not so good news. Food sometimes come with packaging, right? And plastic, has been front and center of causing a lot of, ocean pollutions or maybe even inland pollutions. Some people even think about finding alternative to packaging like plastic. Some even go further, right? Say that we should ban plastic altogether. I mean, from the industrial point of view, do you think banning plastic will help solve the problem? If not so, what are other alternatives that society should pursue, but more importantly, that the industry itself should pursue in helping, providing this solution to this complex problem?
Right on. So one of the big problems for the food and beverage industry is plastics and packaging, right? And the F&B industry is very much in the spotlight because of certain types of brands, Coca-Cola or Danone bottles or PepsiCo bottles are rolling up on Bali Beach, okay? And there is a massive problem with the amount of plastics, sadly, in this part of the world, in marine and ocean environments. So if we take Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, and China, those are the 5 biggest countries in the world that are producing the most amount of marine and ocean waste. So it's a massive problem, okay? It's partly to do with the responsibilities as us as consumers, but it's also the biggest responsibility of trying to put in place infrastructure to allow much of this plastics and packaging to be captured and then potentially to be recycled and then reused. But there are huge issues around regulations about reusing food that's the materials that have had contact with food because of food safety issues. So that's a big problem. What we're seeing is a massive trend on banning single-use plastics, okay? So let's just take straws, for example. This is a feel-good factor, and I'm not saying that it's not, it's not wrong to try and minimize our use of plastics. But if you look at the numbers, then it's less than 1%, 0.01 something percent of all plastics that are accumulated in marine environments are actually straws. So while that can improve and make us feel good and maybe raise more attention to the fact that we need to reduce the amount of plastics we use, that's not going to solve the issue entirely. Although I do understand where policymakers are under pressure to try and implement bans immediately. What we need to look at, though, is, like I said, putting in the right type of infrastructure and then looking at how companies who are producing these type of plastics take more responsibility for the waste that they're producing. So that's something called Extender Producer Responsibility Schemes, EPR. So they're very sophisticated in place in Europe and other markets, but we're looking at how we might implement those in certain markets to allow companies to try and take back some of the more value-add plastics and then recycle them back in. But already you're seeing companies that are using new technologies and new packaging materials. So Danone in Indonesia has already introduced a 100% recycled bottle that actually can be recycled as well. The only challenge with that is to make sure that people are actually using that bottle and then recycling it, right? And then you've got Coca-Cola that's made some commitments. I think actually yesterday they said they're going to extract or take out 9,000 tons of virgin plastic by using recycled materials in some of their brands. Okay, not all of them yet. So there are some steps in the right direction. And then, of course, there's the whole market for alternative types of packaging. And those could be from things like from seaweed or even from algae. So in Bali right now, there's a company that's trying to farm as much seaweed as it can to produce the packaging. The problem is, can that be scaled? And can that still maintain the shelf life of many of the food products? And will that still maintain the integrity of the actual product itself as well? Okay? So there's still a few unanswered questions. But right now, big companies as well as research institutes are pouring millions of dollars. And there's at least $150 million that's sitting in one fund, in a closed-loop fund, or is it Circulate Capital? Forgive me, I can't remember which one, that's ready to be deployed to look at how we solve this problem. So the capital is there. They're just looking at the projects that could be identified and then piloted and then scaled.
So when you said the capital is there, you mentioned something in the neighborhood of billions, right, in terms of addressing this plastic pollution issues. But you also said earlier that it's about infrastructure, building infrastructures, in a place where people can easily sort and recycle. You're also talking about schemes like EPRs, but these things seem to be very costly, either costly to consumer or costly to the industry, for example, right? And then you talk about innovation. Should we looking at a solution to recycle or solution to plastic in a more innovative way, the one that should hopefully are less costly, more convenient and more adaptable for the rest of the societies?
Yeah.
You think are we moving the right way?
We shouldn't use packaging. We should minimize the amount of packaging we use. That's a start, right?
Right.
So there are business models now. So it's not just about the innovation in the materials, but it's looking at the innovation in business models. So in Europe, there's something called Loop, where Haagen-Dazs has teamed up with some e-commerce platform providers to actually deliver ice cream. Okay, so Haagen-Dazs ice cream to your home. All right, it's pretty well established of delivering something to home now. But rather than in plastic or in the multi-layer packaging, it's actually really difficult to recycle. There's a big problem with that type of packaging. Now they're having sort of like, I think it's tin or metal cans that they deliver, and then when someone comes to deliver more ice cream, then you give that one back, and then you get another one. And that's it. It's like a circular economy. You're not using as much plastics and packaging as what you were in the past. So we've got to look at new ideas and new business models for doing that.
Right.
Or quite frankly, just trying to reduce the amount of packaging that's in the marketplace.
Sorry.
You got a call.
Sorry. Where was I? Okay. Yeah, surely there's a lot of innovative ways of approaching plastic or innovative of producing more food, right? Majority of food is being produced also by large companies. How is large companies reacting to innovations? How they're reacting to the different trends of consumers? How are they reacting to competition that's being put forward by startups? How are they fighting back, or are they collaborating? How are they dealing with it?
So we know some of the big established companies globally. There's companies like Cargill that actually many people in here might not have heard of, but Cargill's a big producer of foods, commodities and meat and other value chains, and they're in every single food that you touch, they've had some sort of participation in. But then there's companies like Nestle and Unilever and Coke and Pepsi, Mars, Mondelez, and on, right? These are very, very large, multi-billion-dollar companies. And in an industry, which I said before, which has been quite traditional, this $8 trillion industry that hasn't been disrupted, it's only now beginning to disrupt. So when I mentioned earlier about plant-based, in terms of the whole meat market is could be worth about 1.5 trillion in another 5-10 years, I think. So the market for meat's still going up. But the plant-based movement is only 1% of that, so it's tiny, right? Still, nevertheless, there's a lot of pressure on big companies right now because of the amount of food and agri-tech startups that are disrupting and trying to challenge what the status quo is. Okay, what that's also meant is that consumers are looking for different food products as well. Some of the food products in some companies haven't changed for the last 50 years. These are very, very established brands that have worked, but perhaps they don't resonate with people who are now Gen Z and Gen Y and significantly younger than me, basically. So that's what they're looking at and saying, so our market base is changing. We've got to innovate. And so some of them are more progressive than others. You'll find that some of the multinationals are beginning to try and partner and collaborate with many of the food and ag tech startups. And it's quite simply just watching what's going on out there, because sometimes it can be extremely difficult for a big company to truly innovate and be disruptive. There's only so much you can challenge within the bureaucracy of a big company and the status quo, right? They still answer quarterly to shareholders and everything else, whereas startups, obviously they have investors and VCs who are breathing down their neck, but they can be much more nimble to market and they can pivot and everything else. And they come up with new ideas. And I'll give you one example, right? There's a guy I met who's working with a partner in Thailand, a professor, and this guy's from Singapore, and he wants to disrupt the truffle market. So the truffle market traditionally primarily in France, but also in Italy and a bit in Spain as well, has been,
I think I know that.
You grow basically in orchards, and it's seasonal, and there's all these impacts, and they don't find truffles with pigs, they find them with dogs, by the way. It's not, that's a misconception. But he wants to challenge that industry, and so he wants to grow truffles about 5-10 times the size in indoor farming. He's still working on the flavor profile of this. He hasn't quite got it yet, but this guy's got a background in what? He used to design stores for Nike. He's got no food and ag background. And that, to me, is why some of the big food companies feel a bit threatened, because it's people who have been in those companies for 20, 30, 40 years, and they're very, very traditional in their thinking, right? And you get these new guys coming out of left field and starting to radically change how our food system what it should look like and how they want to do things. So many of the multinationals now just want to find out what those ideas are, what that energy is, and try and tap into that by either collaborating, partnering, acquiring at the right stage, because the valuations for food and ag tech companies are going up, and seeing where they can take that, because doing it themselves is very challenging. It's like changing the direction of the Titanic. So that's what they want to do, and that's how they're doing it. And they can do it through their corporate venture arms, or if you're Nestle and Ferrero, you do it internally off balance sheet. And there are different ways of going to do it. But what they want to do and how they want to work with startups in this part of the world, through FIA, we started to work with about 5 or 6 startups in key theme areas. For us, it's plant-based, cell ag, personalized nutrition, gut microbiome, and healthy aging. And of course, sorry, SIGs, plastics and packaging
Right.
as well. Trying to work with some startups to get some fresh ideas around this as well. So that's how we see it evolving. But it could mean that in the future, many of these big companies are starting to feel a lot more threatened by startups as they get bigger as well.
I think food industry is probably one of the most innovative industries, taking in a lot of new technologies and really change the way that we actually live our life, and hopefully give us better food, we live longer. So, as a person who's been in this business for a long time, how optimistic are you about, the future of food? How optimistic are you about, feeding the 10 billion people?
So, as Om said, right, in about 5-10 years, we've got to feed from 7 to 10 billion people, right? Sadly, though, we've got 2 billion people that are overweight and obese and suffering from chronic diseases. And that can be type 2 diabetes or whatever it is, heart disease or other things. We've still got 800 million, and that's climbing, of people that are malnourished. They're starving. They don't have enough food to eat. We're wasting a third of the food that's produced in the world, which is an absolute travesty, right?
Right.
So a third of that food is being wasted. Agriculture, conventional agriculture right now uses about 70% of fresh water for irrigation. That's the bad news, all right? And if you only look at that bad news, it's like, man, we're screwed, right? How are we going to get ourselves out of this? But I still have a lot of confidence, not just in big companies, but in innovative startups as well, but also the public sector of readdressing and how do we change this current food system that we've got and moving towards a more sustainable food and ag system that we can feed all those people in the future. I mean, that's part of the sustainable development goals that we have, but it's also about consumers as well. And in many ways, us understanding how we need to change our behaviors a little bit in order for us to have a more sustainable food and ag system.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Matt. That's all the time we got.
Okay,
and
cool.
thank you very much to the
Thank you.
audience. Thank you.